Good evening, friends, and welcome to what is certainly going to be an informative and educational discussion about the situation evolving in the Ukraine. We are incredibly fortunate tonight to welcome to Westport Professor Wolodymyr Zaryckyj, the Executive Director at the Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations in New York City. I'm Bill Harmer, the Executive Director of the Westport Library. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, I just want to send a special note of thanks to my friend Mark Yurku. Don't you want to know why? Well, Mark is the one who introduced us to Professor Zaryckyj. Without him, we wouldn't have been able to hold this discussion tonight. So thank you, Mark, for making that happen, making it possible. Now you can applaud. Joining us to facilitate tonight's conversation is our good friend and library supporter, Dan Woog. This man needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Many of you know and are familiar with Dan. He is a lifelong resident of Westport, an alumni of Brown University, and a freelance writer. His work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the USA Today, and Sports Illustrated. For many Westporters, though, Dan's blog, 06880, is the essential primer that we all rely on for news and information about our community and what's happening. And until his recent retirement, Dan was the beloved and much heralded head coach for the Staples High School soccer team. He is also a loyal and talented programming contributor to the library with his bi-monthly podcast, which I hope you all tune into, that we record live from the library stage here. He has also authored 11 books, and for many years now, he has been a leader at the forefront of the LGBTQ community here in Westport. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Dan, who will introduce tonight's special guest.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you for having us. 06880 is now a nonprofit, and one of our missions is to inform the public about important issues. Much of our focus is local, but in writing about Ukraine and Westporters' responses to what was going on there, we realized that while many readers follow the news, most of us don't know much about the country itself. Tonight's session in this amazing space is a way for us to learn more about the history, the geography, and the culture that has led Ukraine to where it is today. And Wolodymyr Zaryckyj is the perfect person to help us understand that. He's Executive Director of the Center for U.S.-Ukrainian Relations. It provides opportunities for senior-level political, economic, security, diplomatic, cultural, and academic experts in the U.S. and Ukraine to exchange views on a wide range of subjects. Dr. Zaryckyj earned graduate and undergraduate degrees from Columbia University, taught political science at NYU for nearly 3 decades, and in recent years he's done postdoctoral research on Eastern Europe. So here's the format. I will ask Dr. Zaryckyj a few general questions. He'll guide us to a deeper, better understanding of Ukraine, and then at the end, we'll take some questions from the audience in person on note cards. So with that, let's begin. Dr. Zaryckyj, we talked the other day, you said that 5 major events define Ukraine. What are they?
Actually, I'm very happy, and I'm also very unhappy that I gave you a map that might have had. You have a very, very good system, and I may have not given it large enough for you. But to start, instead of looking at this map, though this map will help, you should imagine playing Risk at home. If anybody's ever played the game of Risk, they will understand the 5 references in the 5 dates that I start with. Because Ukraine on the Risk board, the Parker brothers had it right. They made it much larger. They made it the way it was originally when it was Kievska Rus. It was the center of not so much Russian or Belarusian or Ukrainian or Bulgar. It was the center of Eastern Slavdom, It was the central city. Remember, in those days, folks, in the 10th and 11th century, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, we're talking about city-states. We're not very far away from the ancient world with their Athens and Rome. The new places are Constantinople, new places are Venice, Genoa. Venice, for instance, had colonies all along the coast of Ukraine in its time, including in Crimea in the 9th and 10th and 11th century, logging colonies and so on and so forth. So just think of the big risk board, and then think of if you're playing Europe, how difficult it is to hold Europe, because they strategically have it right. It is very difficult because you can get hit from the south, from what would be known as the Middle East or South Asia. Then you can possibly you're in a bad, if you're the steppes, someone can cross you over many times, so your Central Asian forces can move through those territories. They did even in ancient times. The Goths, the Visigoths, the Huns, and so on and so forth. And then in the north, you have the Ugric people, and so on and so forth, who often had their fights with the Finno-Ugric people, who had their fights with the Scandinavians, but they also ventured south. They come from North Asia. And so a lot of movement. Why movement? Because those folksmen were nomadic, and that was part of their tradition. I mean, we can now, judge people or prejudge people. I'm not. But one thing that can be said is that when they came with great force and could do a lot of damage. Now, Ukraine, ironically, and there's a slogan about it, "На грані двох світів творити нове життя." On the border of two major places to create a new life. That is between two continents, between Europe and Asia. That's a bad place to be, and especially if you look at that map. Yeah, that's a good map too. When you look at the Black Sea, where it is in reference, the Black Sea and the area above the Black Sea. Can someone give me the NATO map, which is the blue and red one? That one. It's beginning to look a little like the risk board. Did you notice I also snuck in a little NATO and EU in there? Okay, good. Because if you look at this, then you see, man, where Ukraine is, and it's the furthest point. It is the frontier land. Krai actually means Ukraina, not Kievska Rus, which is the original name of the city-state that created all of this. It was there in the 9th and 10th and 11th century. But if you look at this larger issue and map, you begin to realize that this is Krai. That's where Ukraine gets its name. Ukraine is Ukraina, or the borderland. And so Ukraine was the borderland of what might be called Europe. If we put it in that context, then the five that we're going to talk about then becomes clear why it's been sometimes, and it's been called by one of your own, by Timmy Snyder, as the Badlands on one level, because it's in a bad neighborhood. If, in fact, not only about Ukraine, but think of Black Sea, the Black Sea has been a cauldron of struggle for 3,500 years. The Romans and the Parthians, the Macedonians, and the Persians. If you go further back, Troy versus the Hellenics. And in other words, it's a tough neighborhood, and it's tough to hold on because there's migratory forces there. On the other hand, Ukraine is extremely rich, and so we'll start at that first point. The first point is what happens when this wonderful place that is actually a place between two continents and a lot of trade goes on, the original Silk Road, okay? Black Sea and the lands north, which is the Ukrainian lands. You think of all of that trade going on, and then a city-state appears. a very powerful city-state. It's called Kyiv. It appears in the 9th and 10th century. It ends up with a wise leadership from the north. Believe it or not, the English weren't the only ones that got themselves the Normans. We got ourselves the Normans too, the Northmen. They were called the Varangians. They were the Vikings. But instead of traveling by sea, they traveled by land. And they showed up in our neck of the woods. Can we go back to NATO? I know that you... They, out of Sweden and Finland, folks that may soon turn this bluer than Putin would have wanted it, those folks came down and essentially provided a leadership to the Eastern Slavs, with their capital city being Kyiv, the city-state of Kyiv. There were other city-states, smaller, but they swore eventually by the 10th and 11th century, swore fealty to Kyiv. Kyiv, there were things like Novgorod at the beginning, then eventually later on, Moscow in the 11th and 12th century. It was still a swamp in the 9th and 10th century when Volodymyr supposedly christened Ukraine and so on, and has to be remembered. But let's get back to that. In other words, in that Kyiv, you have the leadership itself. Where did the name Rus come from? The name Rus came from the rust-colored hair, strawberry blonde hair that the Scandinavians had. So that leadership of rust-blonde Scandinavians who led Kyiv created the Kyivska Rus, Kievan Rus, which in a sense became the biggest problem we ever did in the 12th, 11th and 12th and 13th century is we tried to expand from a city-state into a nation-state. And in trying to be a nation-state, like the French and the English were already doing, and the Poles and Hungarians, that may have been a mistake. We grabbed too much. We weren't prepared because we were still city-state mode, but we were trying to become a nation-state. And that is actually the first iteration of the Ukrainian nation-state, the Kievan Rus. But in 1241, what happens is something happens, and this is the first moment in that history. The first key moment in history is the Mongol invasion. The Mongols had scouted earlier in 1220s and 1230s, but by the 1240s, 39 and 40, they were convinced that there wasn't enough in Europe to hold them back. And so they launched. And when they launched in the north, and this will explain to you later on when you ask me questions about why Russia and Ukraine are different, this will launch what separates the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Belarusians sort of fell in between, and the Bulgars stayed off to the side. But the difference between the Ukrainians and the Russians was Moscow had just recently had been established. And so in 1239, 1240, it wasn't sure of itself, and it almost immediately submitted to the yoke of the Khans. Now, was that bad? There's a real set of stories about whether the Khans were good or not, whether the Mongol leadership was right or not, but initially it was very harsh. And could be very, let's put it this way, the notion of the Freudian notion of, sort of horde leadership was there. It's a kind of necessary despotism that you had. It softened over time, without question, for over 200 years, but it was still there. What happened in Kyiv in 1241 is the Ukrainians did not submit. There's a church or church grounds in Ukraine, and I took Katie McFarland to see that about 4 or 5 years ago. I remember when or 8 years ago when Poroshenko was elected. And it's interesting because it's astounding to see this is the Alamo, but there's no church. This was the place where the Ukrainians made their last stand against the Mongols in Kyiv, and they got the whole place burnt down. And the Ukrainians We're lucky. All those other beautiful churches you see on CNN and MSNBC, those things, men, have remained. But that church, right down to the ground. Ironically, the Mongols, again, like the Turks in some ways, men, luckily enough, did not burn things down. We're worried that, God forbid, Vlad, do that to the churches, because these things are holy places for us. They're holy in a different way than religiously holy. They are sacred monuments to the kind of genius of human ingenuity and architecture and so on and so forth. And these places did not get necessarily burned down, but the place that did, the Alamo, that church was, and in some ways, I can now transition to the second great date. Well, how? I'm jumping almost 400 years, but let's get back to Ukraine, maybe the first one or second one, hold on. Yeah, let's talk about this. No, this one. It's a little blurry, but you'll get the picture. The fact is, you see where Kyiv is. It's got the Russian spelling of it, but it's up there. It's in the north. There's a river, a great river that runs right through Ukraine. It's called the Dnipro River or the Dnieper River. When the Ukrainians got destroyed, the Kyiv got destroyed, it didn't submit. What they did is they went to the southern regions of Ukraine, right above Crimea, that whole area above Azov, the whole area about where Odessa is in this map. If you look at that whole southern region, the Kozaki, or the Ukrainians that survived that terrible onslaught, that terrible impact, did not submit and made a new life in the wild steppes. Nobody ventured into those wild steppes because this was acres and, miles and miles of just, whatever grew there. And what happened is they settled this area, but because it was black earth, and because they were good farmers, had been good farmers up in the north in the Kievan area, they brought those barley and wheat and oat seeds and planted a lot of stuff in that black earth. And it flowered, it blossomed, and what you ended up having is a new civilization, but in the southern region. Why don't we get one of our war pictures up there, because I've just realized that this should have been put in a better context. Can someone give me another map, the most recent? The war maps, the very contemporary ones, because I think they have, yeah, all right. Yes, thank you. Now, if we could talk about it, this second place is Zaporizhia. Here is on that bend. If you see the great river, Dnipro, it goes right through Ukraine. It's there, and it's where the Russians are, in fact, fighting the force. In Zaporizhia, what happened, essentially, the Ukrainians that settled, because essentially, if you're Americans, you would understand that this is the Wild West. Nobody reaches out there. So in effect, in this crazy Wild West, but it has black earth, what happened is those crazy characters that settled there did two things. One, they created their own defense units, self-defense, samobrana, and they became very good farmers. And they held great lands. In fact, they were wealthy enough when they exported all this, and by the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, began to export it first to the Ottoman Empire, down below, and then up to the Poles above, and the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation was growing. What essentially happened is they became extremely wealthy, and what they did is in this region, if I can get up, can I, Chuck? Yeah, if I can get up, in this region where you see, it looks like almost a lake, if not a little sea and stuff, that whole area, this area here in Zaporizhia, they had a series of islands, and on those islands, they would bring their boys to train. The women, literally, the women, it's almost like Spartan society. The women were given economia. They were given all of it. they were given all the lands, they ran everything. They ran the kids, they ran the help, they ran everything. The men trained for 6 to 12 months a year in a place called Sich. They essentially became special forces. And they became so powerful that they became a military caste. And in the 15th and 16th century, this is not to be confused with those Russian Black 100s in the 20th century that were chopping people up, Cossacks. That's the Russian Imperial Guard. These guys were called the Cossacks. These Cossacks in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, what they essentially did is created a great military caste. And what they did is they were freewheeling. They had literally, like the pirate republics you see on Netflix, they had but it wasn't a pirate because social banditry is unfair. I know Linda Gordon has sometimes said that it almost skirted that. But they were a tough bunch. And they created one of the finest military units in Europe. They were so powerful that eventually what happens is they were hired by the Ottomans. The Ottomans even had a name for them, Janissaries, or were brought into slavery and brought up, to be their troops, because they also captured Kuzaket, the ones that didn't want to go, and the Poles. The Poles hired them to do their work, because the Poles, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, had the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation, and that was a very powerful unit. It was as powerful as anything that the Habsburgs had. In fact, it was more powerful because in 1683, now let me just one step back. In the 1640s, those same crazy Kuzaker suddenly get ambitious and they say, wait a minute, why are we doing this mercenary work? I know we're living free, but why are we doing this mercenary work when we can have our own country? Why can't we be like the French and the Brits and so on and so forth? It occurred to them. And so guess what? They got on the horse, they got to Kiev, which had been flattened. It was like Rome. You know, Rome was million in the ancient times, was 20,000 in medieval times, so 30, 50, and then suddenly in the 19th and 20th century, back to business. Well, that happened with Kiev. The Kuzakia came into Kiev, took it, created a government, and then decided, well, we really want to retire back to our place. We don't want to do the rest. You guys can run the rest of the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians had settled. They had actually broadly settled, not only in the steppes, but they had also settled in the Carpathians. But by settling in the Carpathians, they ran into the Poles. And since the Poles were stronger, the Poles eventually took them into their Commonwealth, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But instead of making it Polish and Lithuanian and Ukrainian, they made it only Polish and Lithuanian. And today we have the problem, Ariel Cohen is right, because if all three had been in the Confederation, today they'd all be in NATO and nobody'd be arguing about this. Anyway, why is this important? Because in 1683, those same crazy Cossacks, now the Ottomans, and let's get back to that map that has all of Europe, that has Europe essentially. The NATO map will be okay. Now, think of this. Turkey today, we remember it as this. But just think of Ottomans stretching all the way out into Central Asia. I mean, literally out into, not quite the borders of China and stuff like that, but all of Central Asia, onto Turkey, onto the Arab states and so on and so forth. This enormous thing called the Ottoman Empire, which had cracked the back of Constantinople. It now knows, 200 years later, it's aiming for what? It's aiming for this place. It's aiming for Austria. But why is it aiming for Austria? Because Austria happens to be the home, Vienna, and Vienna happens to be the home of the Habsburgs, the most powerful Europeans. If you're going to take somebody down, you have to take the most powerful. So that's what they've done. They take the most powerful, and what they do is they also understood that the Habsburgs at that moment were also the inheritors of the Holy Roman Empire, which was once, you know, remember the old joke, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But the fact is, it was the seat of European power in the 17th century. And so the Ottomans come together with the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs are desperate. They go to the Poles. The Poles have a very good army, but they know that they can't do it on their own. They call the Ukes. They call the Cossacks. And in 1683, in front of the gates of Vienna, and then eventually in a series of battles in Hungary, the Ukes do what? The Ukes help the Poles to stop the Ottomans. The Ottomans had tried this 200 years earlier, had been stopped, but came back more powerful. After that punch in the nose, the Ottomans never came back. And that actually is the second stage of Ukrainian history. The reason why I'm doing it is that if you're asking me of 5, I'm trying to tell you where the resilience that you're so shocked by. What's this nation that you've heard when over the last 20 years, all you've heard is, and they were involved in this corruption and they're that, and they were involved in our elections and they really stink and how did they suddenly take on the biggest army on the planet? And it's a nasty army, and they took them out. That's because they've got a tradition, folks. They had a tradition with Kiev and Rus. They said, we will not give in. If anybody wants to know what will happen with Mariupol today, that place that has those 2,000, they really honestly think that they're going to go down. And Putin knows that if he doesn't put them down, they'll climb out of those bunkers and they'll come after him if he then moves his armies north. If we look at that old, our new war maps, if you think of eastern Ukraine, you'll see, man, that it could be very difficult. But why am I doing that? Because I want to go back now to the third moment. The same way as the Poles and the Ukrainians are able to do that in 1683, the third moment in history, again, this time it was which color of Russian imperialism are you going to face from the east in 1920, whether the white Guardists that were becoming basically what Ilyin and his crowd basically becoming in 19 to 20, Denikin certainly did, a proto-fascist on one hand, the white Guardists, and then the red Guardists, the Bolsheviks. Now, in effect, the Bolsheviks and the white Guardists, extreme right, extreme left, I don't have to explain to anybody, these folks, man, did what? In 1920, they were about to move in on all of Europe after World War I, after the Soviet Union was formed. And it was at that moment that the Ukrainians who had lost as a result of being a little bit too wild, never getting that hetmanite, that thing in Kiev, they left it onto its own. That got broken between the Poles and the Russians and eventually between Austro-Hungary and Russia. So Ukraine was broken in two. But in the World War I period, Ukraine, in a third iteration of itself, shows up on the map again. The same Ukes. And people have said, according to a guy like Putin, who's a chauvinist and believes in Denikin's theories of history and so on and so forth, he said, okay, that's not possible. These guys weren't there. Well, what are you talking about that weren't there? Those Ukrainians were there, and they've had a pretty sophisticated history for almost 1,000 years. In fact, they've got an older history than your history. So in 1920, those same Ukes now get up as the war winds down. They get up. Putin blames Lenin for this happening, but they essentially, Lenin, in order to have peace in Europe, he decides, I'm going to let the Ukrainians, the Georgians, and all these little countries on the borders of the Russian Empire, as the old Tsarist Empire is falling, I'm going to let them go. Then he regrets it, too. And when he regrets it, first, he takes out the white Guardists. That is, he takes out, in the Russian Revolution, first in 1919, he takes the white Guardists, and then he comes with his red Guardists and his new Siberian troops that the Bolsheviks had been able to preempt. And in this third moment of history, he now comes after both Petlura, who's running the Ukrainian National Republic, the third iteration of the state, and Pilsudski, both social democrats, both tied to each other, both not liking both either the Reds or the Whites. What happens is they are able to capture Kiev, but hold it only shortly. After that, the front falls and deep retreat in 1920, all the way to Warsaw. But it's the Ukes and the Poles standing together again. We've had our differences. The Poles and the Ukes are tough neighbors also with each other. But in those moments, we stood the ground, and it's known as the miracle of the Vistula River. In that moment, what essentially happens is the Ukes, they could have stayed home and tried to defend Ukraine instead of trying to defend Poland. But they went all the way to Warsaw and became the right flank. And when Trotsky's armies, very powerful armies, some of the White Guards had joined it. They had given up on the idea. They figured that Red Russia is better than no Russia. And so in effect, that entire battle is whether that entire hurma, as the Poles and the Ukrainians understood it, would sweep right into Europe. And remember, Europe was very soft at that point. Germany had just lost the war, and the communist movement was very, very powerful. The communist movement in Germany, and so Germany would have been very different. In other words, all of Europe would have been different. Certainly, the Eastern European countries that we have, the Romanias, the Bulgarias, the Czechia, Slovakia, and Poland, and so on, if that had broken, we would have had Bolshevism in Eastern Europe in 1920. And the consequences, we know the Stalinist consequences in 33, the Ukrainians know the famine. In fact, while they won that battle with the Poles, they couldn't win the peace. And in Versailles, they were splintered into 4 parts, the Ukrainians. One, luckily enough, ended up with the Poles, and the Poles half decently treated the Ukrainians. The other ended up with Czechoslovakia, and the third with Romania. The biggest part in 1920, did you notice I got you to 1920? You say, Jesus Christ, this guy is starting in the 10th century. He's never going to end. This is not going to end, man, until 12 o'clock, midnight and stuff. Guys, man, Jesus Christ, I've been doing this for a while. Anyway, all right? Look at this. We're already in the 20s. No, we're in the 30s at this point, because the biggest splinter was the Bolshevik splinter, and that splinter ended up, that eastern part that ended up, that part that was depopulated by the terrible genocide that happened that first time. I hate to say it, man, but there was the only quote that I've ever wanted to own up to was the one that I made about Holodomor, that it's the one genocide whose last chapter has not been written yet. Because in the 30s, what the Bolsheviks did is they took, you can say, well, is it 4 million, 6 million, 10 million, over time, when you look at the dekulakization, when you took all the rich peasants, and we had more rich peasants, you don't have rich peasants in the tundra. You have rich peasants in the steppes where you grow things. Okay, so the first part, the rich peasants, that's 2 million. Then you get the 4.5 million in that 32 to 35 period. But then, is anybody counting the Great Terror? You're talking about 8 to 10 million Ukes gone. And what happens? In 41, 42 to 40 to 45, those same Bolsheviks, and let's be honest, I wrote an article about it last year with my friend Janusz Bugajski writing the other, as a Pole writing it as well. And let's be honest, what did the Bolsheviks do? They couldn't get it the first time. 20 years later, what did Stalin do? He makes a pact with whom? With Hitler. And he gives Hitler a whole bunch of wheat and steel. And what does Hitler do with that? It takes the North, takes the West, takes the South. You don't think that Hitler was going to go after him? Get the picture? Oh, I know you do. All right? So in effect, by 1939 to 41, Stalin has done exactly what he wanted to do. So what does he pick up? The Baltic states, he picks up a piece of Poland, and here a piece of France. Oh, that's the wrong one. Producers, different, that's the fascist, not the communist. All right, but the fact is, they divide between the Nazis and the communists, and they divide Eastern Europe. Okay? Now, where do the Ukes stand in all this? Those crazy Ukes ended up, and everybody wants to know why they're doing partisan resistance, they end up creating a partisan army. And I know that they've been all sorts of rumors. Oh yeah, they killed Poles. No, they killed Jews. No, they killed the Russians. No, they killed this. Guys, they had an underground that took the guns away from the Germans and started shooting. And then when the Germans left, they had the same underground that in the early Cold War gave the Russians cold chills, and that's why that general who commented to Putin before the war started, that colonel general who said, hey, I know because my buddies, man, taught me in school, you get those Ukrainians in those Carpathian mountains and you're never going to get them out. Get the picture? The fourth moment in history. You can't get the Ukes out that easily. And that Eastern Ukrainians, even those Eastern Ukrainians, the poor ones, man, that ended up on the Bolsheviks and actually believed some of the stuff that, the Russians were selling in their red form, that we're all brothers and we all love each other. Well, guess what? 40% of the Soviet army was made up of Ukrainians. And it was the first Ukrainian front that liberated Berlin. It's an interesting history, folks, because even that, they tried to suppress it, but Annie Applebaum, God love her, she not only has done a great work on the Holodomor, but she did brilliant work on the gulags. These guys didn't know, why did Stalin, after Stalin died in the 50s, why did Khrushchev have to let go of the gulags? He had to let go of the gulags because what happened was the Ukrainian freedom fighters and their little forest brothers, man, the Lithuanians, the Balts, and so on and so forth, they all ended up in the same jails, up in the gulags and labor camps up in Siberia. And in 1954, when Stalin dies, they go into absolute rebellion. Get the picture? You talk about resilience, rebellion. And it's that same spirit that gives you those powerful dissidents in the 50s, in the 60s and 70s, who then tie with the refuseniks. And in the 70s, with Sakharov, create a real movement. And I'll honor the Russian Democrats, the Sakharovs, the Elena Boners, and so on and so forth, who actually then reach out and say, well, the Ukrainians deserve a Helsinki group and the Georgians deserve it and so on. And with that, we get to the fifth moment. We get to that moment that the Russians, and I'm sure all of you have seen HBO, Chernobyl, okay. You get to the fifth moment because while they had the dissidents, they kept shipping those dissidents, regardless of what Carter was saying or Reagan said, they kept shipping them to the gulags. Even into the early 80s, and we lost poets that way. Our most famous poet, the Ukrainian poet, man, dies in the gulags in '84. But in that, those guys kept the yeast in the ground, and in '86, the Russians, with that terrible thing that they did in Chernobyl, and then worse, when the Chernobyl thing happens, their elite, even amongst in the Communist Party. That's how the Ukrainian Communist Party split from the Russian Communist Party. The Russians had passports that could take them to Moscow when the dust began to settle. The Ukrainian communists couldn't go to Moscow, could they? And so in 87 and 88, as Gorbachev says, man, let's open this stuff up, they end up joining hands with the dissidents. And by 91, you've got the Ruch movement, and by 91, the Russians are saying, oh, Jesus, those bozos are back. A young Putin sitting in Dresden understood that's how the Soviet Union ended up ending. In 91, the Ukes men basically said, yeah, we don't want this thing. You had your putsch in August of whatever it was, 91, and in effect, then, now we want to move on. Now, did the Russians leave it alone? Soviet Union fell apart. Could have gone, we could have done it, but the Russians kept insisting on what Ariel Cohen calls putting Russian uncles in. In other words, in the shadows dominate the economy, in the shadows dominate the culture, in the shadows dominate all the stuff. So what did the Ukes do? In 2004, the Ukes men have the Orange Revolution. You've seen it. In 2014, you saw the revolution on Maidan. 1 million Kievans. This is why Ben Hodges turned around to me and says, are you kidding me? Man, it'll take 300,000 to take Kiev, and Putin's brought, to this gunfight, he's brought 200,000 for the entire country? What's he, sick? Anyway, the bottom line is that if you look at that 2014 period, you begin to realize that's the fifth moment, because we had to clean house again, because Putin had thought, even after Orange, he had discredited and basically done a disinformation thing like in our politics. We understand that politics because it's, Charlottesville, the ultra-left and the ultra-right, and it's all made up by the same disinformed units and stuff. In Ukraine, that kept happening. And so in 14, the reason why the Ukrainians rose up is because the clown, Yanukovych, had stripped the army down to 6,000. 6,000 regulars. So those same crazies that were in Kiev, that had run around in Kiev, and they called them volunteer, and Putin kept saying, yeah, they're all Nazis and stuff like that. Those characters all decided, we'll volunteer, we're going to do something because we can't do this. We want to be, and they want to be Nazis. They wanted to go into EU. They wanted to go NATO. I understand if they wanted to do some cultish thing and stuff, but no, but they were trying to become this. Can you see Ukraine and Georgia? They were trying to do NATO. I mean, how did that Nazi stuff come up? So in effect, that the Ukes for the fifth time proved they could put together an army. And what was shocking to Putin is that while he took Crimea, because the US and everybody else said, listen, don't fight for it because it's you're not going to win this. When it came to Donbass, we couldn't. And so what happens is we flooded Donbass. The Ukrainians flooded at Donbass. We went into Donbass. And we fought them over 4 years into a trench war standstill with 6,000 against their mighty army. So those 5 moments, Jesus, did I take a lot of time? I sure did, didn't I? And I'm really sorry I did. I really am. But I thought that if I could, if those 5 moments, they would define literally what has happened and what's happening in Ukraine today. In effect, Putin looked at that and he said, they're back. And he understood, and at that point, that the Ukes, that second question you asked me about geography, they understood that this was a bad neighborhood. They had learned how to fight in a bad neighborhood.
So let me ask you that, where was the US in all this? From World War II on, how have we treated Ukraine?
The US men in 47, 48, in terms of containment, there were two theories in American politics. There was containment and rollback. And probably, I'm going to say something about American politics. There's real wisdom to both the Democrats and the Republicans when they're not being too hyper-polarized. Because in some ways, the Democrats and Truman and Keenan did it right when they said containment. I can't believe that as a big uke, running around, I would not say that. Years ago, I would have denounced containment. I would have said, well, that threw the Balts and us and the Georgians and all the people of the Soviet Union back into into the cauldron and permanently. But I must say that containment was a good idea because otherwise we would have had a World War III. But when the chance came in the 80s, it was good that the Americans, and I don't care, I do care what my audience thinks, but I'm not, I don't care what your politics is. But in the same way as the Truman Kennedy crowd were smart in the way they did things, Ronald Reagan was smart in what he did. There was a moment in history in the 80s where they were weaker. They were economically on last legs, the Soviet Union. And so I would say that I'll give a compliment that the Americans pre-Soviet Union, in Soviet Union period, they played it right, both in terms of containment when they used it in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and they were right when they eventually backed rollback. What does rollback mean? Those nations that were known as the captive nations, the 15 republics that remained inside Russia. Russia was recognized as an empire. Earlier, it was tough to call it an empire because only capitalists had empires. Socialists couldn't. By the nature of the beast, they couldn't have empires. Well, guess what? The Russians had an empire, even if it was socialist. And so, in effect, I must say, man, that the fight for the captive nations and breaking it up eventually up and being smart enough to insist on that the Soviet Union might have to dissolve was a very good thing. Afterwards, I think the Clinton period was a very good period. I think the Clinton period was a very good period, just generally in American politics. My professor was big Brzezinski, so he basically convinced me that the Americans could have been the first, last, and only hyperpower men in history, and could have turned into this sort of League of Democracies. That was the plan in the 90s. They even sold it to the Ukrainians. That's why the Ukrainians, oh, this is awful. This is the one thing you never want to do, is to do that. Sorry, folks. But I must say, man, that both Bill and Zbig understood this sort of dynamic well enough that if you really move quickly, you might be able to create a League of Democracies, a worldwide League of Democracies, and you could pull along moderate Republicans, certainly the moderate Republicans like the McCains and so on and so forth. In fact, more radical Republicans would go for it too, in terms of national security. The idea is that we could create an international League of Democracies, not just NATO, but bring in India. Certainly, man, was developing into a real democracy. Australia, Japan, South Korea. These were folks, men, that had moved on to a kind of civilized view of the universe and stuff like that. And civilized in this meaning, not of any sort of cultural thing, but in terms of political civilization. Understood, men, liberal democracy, good old, what's his name? Francis Fukuyama was right. Liberal democracy was probably the final form. It was okay. It was tweedledee, when we talked about tweedledee, tweedledum politics and stuff like that, and we all got into a town square and could talk to each other and get things resolved. And I think that was the dream, because if you had that, if republics were formed around the world, the notion was, it was Kant's perpetual peace. It was democracies really don't fight each other. I know that everybody's saying, well, look at the Russians, but they're not a democracy, and they're being fed a bunch of bullshit. Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, I didn't really mean that. That I didn't mean. Sorry about that. But they're being fed a bunch of malarkey, and so that's not democracy. But democracies as such, republics, or democracies, they don't go to war with each other. And if we could create a whole bunch of them, we could be in a good place. And somehow in the last 20 years, we've lost our way. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that a guy called Putin took over the moment Clinton left.
A couple of questions before we go to the audience questions, and those will be
sorry about the long-windedness, man, guys.
No. You're talking about presidents. I think when Americans paid attention to who the president of Ukraine is, they were surprised to find he was a Jewish comedian.
And a good one, too.
How did that happen?
Well, you know, in some ways, I was telling you, men, that they're all very practical. The Ukes men are very practical, and they've watched a wonderful show. Yeah, I mean, it's one thing you got to remember. Zelensky is an excellent, excellent lawyer. He's a smart guy. He's politically astute. This isn't a guy in the last rodeo show. And so, in effect, and I just realized what a terrible stereotype I just used, but the fact is that, no, it's that he's a very smart guy and everybody underestimated. He had created an entire, he had created an entire series for himself. He was the character who created a show in which he said, what if I went to the Ukes, because they've been plagued by all this corruption. It was. I mean, the Russian uncles kept everything, man, in their own hands. If you've ever seen the Netflix thing, Occupied, that the Norwegians take, I mean, they basically just sort of manipulate everything and so on. And Zelensky said, what if I, a humble teacher, if I played a humble teacher and I ran for president and made it? What would happen? I'd be the everyman. And that is a sign of democracy, folks, because that's what was told to me by a Swedish parliamentarian who told me a great story that said that woman got on a bike when she was unhappy with her school, wheeled into Stockholm, ended up running politically, ended up running for parliament, ended up minister of education, ended up the prime minister, and then after two terms off, got on the same bike and went back home. That's democracy. And Zelensky was that on a screen. Got it? Every night he came in and he was saying, could you imagine if we could do that? Whether you buy the fact that we're a corrupt capitalist pig, you know, Lex Luthor is the ultimate, capitalist, or you buy the other end, man, that it's a deep state and we're all, whatever quanon you're on and stuff like that. The fact is, man, he understood that that's all a bunch of malarkey. He understood that what you have to do is actually talk facts to the folks. And he did in his show. And they loved him. And they also proved something else, because the Ukes had a bad reputation about this, about Jewish-Ukrainian relations. And I'm not going to, that's not going to be hidden. But the fact is that over the last 100 years, and I've actually studied it, I discovered, men, that actually a lot less of it than a lot of people. 300 years ago, there was a lot of stupidity. When the serfsmen were rebelling and so on and so forth, a lot of ignorance. But not in the last 100 years. In the last 100 years, the more I studied, and now my good old, very good liberal friend, Mark von Hagen over at Columbia, studied as well, and his last work before he died was proof in the pudding. He said the Russians had kept doing this in the 20th century, trying to paint the Ukrainians, starting with Petliura, then on to World War II with the Banderas and all this other stuff, and then on to our time. They've been trying to paint us in the darkest possible colors. And they were hoping to get to this point. I think if you want to know what's happening today, in fact today, on Victory Day, when he's screaming Nazis, he made up the story, the Russians and his own Denikin, who was the biggest anti-Semite of all, and stuff like that, made up these stories, and then they processed it against the Ukes, and the Ukes turned around and did something more wonderful. They said, we've had a Jewish population in Ukraine for almost 1,000 years. There were talk of basically half the artisanry, the artisans in Kiev, they were Jewish in the 11th and 12th century. They've been around for 1,000 years. They are like the Crimean Tatars. They're us. Zelensky feels the same way about Sophia. He may be Jewish, but when he got in St. Sophia, he talked about it as if it was his sacred shrine. It's moving. And so Zelensky is moving. And so he won by 75%, folks. 75% is a big margin. It's not a joke. And so, and he's now moved beyond that because all the stuff, that moment in Munich, you want to talk sixth point, that moment in Munich, when he got up there and he knew he's a good actor. And I hate to say it, and I don't care what anybody thinks about Ronnie Reagan, but Ronnie Reagan was able to deliver a line. And so is Zelensky. And when Zelensky gets up there in the Munich security and tells everybody, first on stage and then gets off stage, because I heard what happened off stage, and he says, I don't need a ride, I need ammo. That's, you know, there's something Churchillian about it.
Yeah.
It really is. And you can't, and it's his personality. And so that's that combination of things that he brought to his own personality. They all fitted, and maybe the Lord does watch over those crazy little creatures that he's got. Okay, so sorry about the answer, but.
So and again, please, if you have a question, there are note cards and they will get picked up and brought up. So you've brought us here to where we are with Ukraine and the US. As we Westporters and people listening, as we listen to the news, as we watch the news, as we see what's happening, what should we keep in mind about the nation and the people? You've told us how they've gotten to where they are. What should we be keeping in mind about the country and its people as we follow the news now?
I think the one trait that I would say of all of it, I mean, I've actually written something about it just now, or just recently, is resilience. I think, man, the one thing is resilience. Actually, I should add, it's not just resilience, it's resourcefulness. The average uke will not wait for someone to give him orders. The average uke will try to take care of it himself. That's actually, and I looked at it, my grandfathers, my fathers, I looked at my mothers and grandmothers without question. I mean, they were able to get by. I once looked at that, and they got by in the 30s. They got by through the Nazi occupation. They ended up as slave laborers. They were brought in as Osterbeiters. I mean, so when someone tells us, man, Nazi collaborated, Osterbeiters, I mean, 3 million Ukrainian Osterbeiters who were in those bombed out factories, because the Germans weren't in those factories. The Nazis wouldn't put the Germans in some of those factories when they started getting really badly bombed. They put slave laborers, Osterbeiters, and that's who are Osterbeiters. Ost means east, Beiters, workers, east workers. Who were the east workers? They didn't control Russia. That was a military zone. It was a fighting zone. They controlled Ukraine. And so they took Ukrainian slave workers. And I looked at all these old folks that I grew up with, and I realized after the slave labor, they spent 4 years in displaced person camps. And you know what they ended up doing? They ended up creating their own theater groups. They ended up educational systems. They ended up, and I was blown away by the fact, man, that they did all this in displaced person camps. So I began to realize, you don't mess with people like that, because they're tactical. In other words, but tactical. They can be strategic, but they're capable of enormous flexibility. They're like sergeants instead of generals, and so are we late already? Badly? Okay, sorry.
2 questions.
Okay.
A couple of questions. It says, to what extent are charges of Ukrainian Nazism the result of what happened during World War II, when the Ukrainians treated the Germans as liberating them from Stalin's communism? That is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That,
it's funny, because I've gone over that period of history, and that has to be, man, when I look at Stalin's 2-year collaboration with Hitler and the 7-day collaboration with that supposedly the Ukrainians did, ironically, that underground that I was telling you about that had actually fought, and the Romanians, the Poles, the Czechs, and so on and so forth, eventually the Hungarians, because Carpathian Ukraine, that western splinter, all the way on this side, Hungary still wants it. Those folks, men, were not under Bolshevism. They created an underground. And that underground, by 1939, understood that Hitler was not our friend, because Hitler sided not with the Carpathian Ukrainians in 39. He sided with Hungary in Horthy. Let's be honest, Horthy, that tradition in Hungary today, is what's blocking all of Europe from stopping the oil embargo. That guy Orban, that's really scary. While we have Zelensky, they've got Orban, which is a replay of the 1930s and proto-fascist types. So I hate to say, because I've always loved the Hungarians. I thought that 56, they were super. So meanwhile, if you look at that period of time, so 39, now in 41, there was a moment in which, as Hitler is moving, the underground moved and wanted to declare a government. June 30th, literally, 1941. And there was a whole bunch of stuff that, yeah, those Ukrainians, man, were moving in. They were Nazis because they were moving in. Well, within 6 days, I know because one of those was my grandfather, they were put under house arrest. Half of them, 2 months later, ended up in Sachsenhausen, in Mattenhausen. My father-in-law went blind in Mattenhausen. And he was part of the underground. So when someone tells me that they welcomed that first 7, 8 days, it was true that in view. And for this, if there is, someday I will personally make it my mission to take out, even if they're 98 years old, if there was someone there in that first 7 days when the Hitlerites, man, showed up in Lviv and said, look what the Bolsheviks did to your people, there was some stupidity done. My friend Herb Romerstein wrote about it. And he also then qualified it and backed us in the 80s and said, guys, 7 days might have been some, they walked in, but when they realized that notice the Ukrainians are the only ones that did not have a puppet regime in World War II. So much for your Nazi collaboration. The Croatians might have ended up with those. The Norwegians ended up with those. Guess what? France, it's called Vichy France. Vichy. Did you hear of a Ukrainian Vichy government? So in effect, what we've tried to do is, and that's why history has to separate itself, because yeah, there's stupidity. There has been stupidity. I said 17th century stupidity, ignorant serfs thing. Bozos in Western Ukraine who might have done something stupid in the first 7 days, unprovoked by anybody, man, in the underground. That's another thing, and that's evil and it has to be condemned. But what can't be done is what they've done, which is that the movement itself was Nazi. Because that's where the falsification of history happens and why we're getting what we're getting. We're getting a Jewish Ukrainian who, in some of the left-wing propaganda, and I've had pictures of it, he's in a suit, in an SS suit. You got to be kidding me. You got to be kidding me. I mean, the word oxymoron doesn't do it justice. Okay, so that's why I'm glad that someone asked that question, because I decided you have to deal with it head on. Sure. Yeah.
And the last one, we have time for one more. Uh-huh. Easy one here. Was it wrong to give Crimea to Russia?
Why didn't you just drop a grenade in the thing? precisely because Biden is doing good work. I don't want to say that the Obama-Biden administration made a mistake, but they did in 2014. And it wasn't, and it's not Obama or Biden, though Obama more than Biden, because Obama liked this person. He liked Angela Merkel. And Angela Merkel made one mistake in 2008. I wrote an article about it on the 10th anniversary. In 2008, when the Georgians and Ukrainians were offered map, she said, and my German friend Nico Langer wrote to me, she said, yes, but not now. After that, Georgia got hit in 2008 and Ukraine got hit in 2014. If Merkel had not advised that in 2008 and then further not advised Obama, you know, Jesus Christ, they're not going to be able to hold Crimea and so on and so forth, you know, it's because we're not going to help them at all. Well, how about a little sanction? Obama asked, how about a little sanction? You know, God, you know, really? I mean, and so in effect, nothing. And so the Ukrainians, who had just had a post-revolutionary government, had only 6,000 in their army at the time. What were they going to do? Hold Crimea when the guy had just landed 30,000? So Crimea then basically went. But the fact is, folks, if things don't go well, and I'll end it with this, he's lost historically something that he can never take back. He's lost the Battle of Kiev. If he now loses the Battle of Donbass, it's quite possible, and it would be up to you folks, because you will be important, your voters. If the Ukrainians now decide, well, guess what? His armies are so decimated that we might be able to move on Donbass, the part that he occupied, and guess what? We might even be able to move on Crimea, because he's scared. Remember that little boat that we sank with that Neptune? He's scared of getting amphibians on. And if we blow up the bridge connecting, you know, Crimea to the rest of Russia, right there and right here, there's one tiny bridge. If he can't use his boats anymore, because the Neptune's around, and now the Brits have given some really fancy stuff. The one thing that the Ukes can do is blow up a bridge that connects. Literally, is the only thing that connects them, and that will shut down troops into Crimea. And now, the fact is, he may take Mariupol, but I'm not sure. We're not sure at this point. And so, folks, this is probably, let's put it this way, you're living in the most important time in history, ever. This is decisive. It's something that you really have to really think about. Wrap it. My friend Adrian Kurtnitsky ran Freedom House. He made me wrap my head around it. He says, you know, when the fall of the Soviet Union, it was me and the Pope and Ronnie Reagan and Wałęsa. We broke it up by doing solidarity. But Walter, nothing like this. This is big. We're living through it. And if he introduces tax nukes, then we have a real problem. And I'll leave you at that. Tac nukes change everything. So.
No answers. We were looking for answers. No answers, but I think we are all, we understand 1,000 years of Ukrainian history in an hour and 5 minutes. You have, you know, you've brought us to a good place. You've helped us understand. And Professor Walter Zaryckyj, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, folks. You're a good audience, and I'm sorry that I drove you nuts for an hour, but Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate the questions and everything else. Appreciate the audience. Thank you.